The most profound act of strength is rarely what we imagine. It is not a voice raised in anger, nor a display of force. It is not loud, nor is it violent. It is the quiet, deliberate choice to say nothing when every fiber of your being screams to explain, to fight, to demand justice. It is walking away without a final word, denying them the comfort of a clean conclusion, refusing them the one thing they crave most: certainty. For the human mind does not linger on what is complete. It obsesses over the unresolved, the questions left hanging in the air. And when you withhold that final chapter, not from cruelty, but from a place of profound self-discipline, you create a silence so resonant it will echo in their minds for years. This is not revenge. It is power. Not the kind that seeks to rule others, but the kind that sets you free. The Stoics understood this well. They taught that we must first master ourselves before we can ever hope to master the world around us. To choose stillness in the face of chaos, restraint in the place of reaction. And sometimes, the highest form of self-respect is to simply walk away, leaving others to grapple with the weight of their own actions, unburdened by an explanation they would only use as a shield. There is a deep, primal discomfort in an unfinished thought, in a silence where an answer should be. The human mind, for all its brilliance, was not built for ambiguity. It is a machine designed for survival, and uncertainty registers as a threat. An unresolved conflict feels like a lingering danger. This is why closure holds such power. Not because it can alter the past, but because it provides a neat container in which to store it, a place to file away the chaos and label it finished. Yet, not every story deserves a conclusion. Not every wound is meant to be neatly stitched. Sometimes the most honest act is to leave the page blank. For in truth, no sentence, no apology, no justification could ever capture the full weight of why something had to end. And the more they demand an answer, the more they reveal their true motive. It is not healing they seek, but control. They do not wish to move on. They wish to make sense of you, to reduce you to a single, digestible reason they can whisper to themselves when the silence grows too loud. When you deny them that tidy explanation, a strange thing occurs. They do not depart. They linger. They excavate the past, analyzing every word, every glance, every silence. And in this frantic digging, they only bury themselves deeper. For the answers they seek are not hidden within you. They are buried in the unexamined corners of themselves. That aching need for resolution is not about you. It is about the void in their own self-understanding. It is the need to be chosen, to be right, to be the author of the final chapter. The moment you walked away without explanation, you stripped them of their power to shape the narrative. And that is a loss that does not scar the body, but the ego. Seneca once observed, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it." And how much time is wasted chasing ghosts? Not the ghosts of people, but of conversations that never happened. Not closure itself, but the illusion of how it might have felt. They will replay your silence like a puzzle, convinced they can solve it. But silence is not a puzzle. It is a wall, a quiet, unshakable boundary that declares, "Here, my explanation ends, and here, your speculation begins." If they choose to circle that wall, they do so by their own accord. No one is trapped in the past unless they choose to live there. You do not need to clarify your absence. You do not need to explain why the calls stopped, why you no longer appeared, why you took a step back. The moment you do, you invite them back into a narrative that no longer serves your peace. You offer them a role in a story they no longer deserve. Withholding closure is not an act of punishment. It is an act of protection. It is shielding your peace from those who would never have understood it anyway. And perhaps that is what stings them the most, the realization that you did not even deem it worthy of an explanation, that you didn't need a final scene, a dramatic speech, a breakdown. You just needed to be done. The mind despises such an ending, one with no climax, no confrontation, no resolution. It feels incomplete. But sometimes, the most powerful closure is the absence of it, for it forces the mind to sit in the acute discomfort of not knowing. This is where growth begins, not in peace, but in the friction of uncertainty. It begins with the acceptance that not every question will be answered, not every story will be understood, and not every connection will be granted a proper goodbye. And that is not weakness, that is reality. Some believe closure is a right, that a shared history of love or friendship entitles them to know why it ended. This belief is born of ego, from the illusion that understanding brings peace. But it often doesn't. More often, an explanation only opens new wounds. You offer them truth, and they twist it. You give them reasons, and they debate them. You attempt a dignified exit, and they call you cold. Why explain what they are determined not to hear? It requires immense strength to let silence be your answer, because silence will always be misinterpreted. It will be painted as cruelty, as avoidance, as arrogance. But those labels cease to matter when your actions are rooted in clarity, when your choice not to speak is anchored in peace, not pride. If they fail to understand that, the burden is not yours to carry. It is theirs. People crave completion because they believe it grants them permission to move on. But permission is not granted by others. It is found within. And if they have not learned how to give it to themselves, no explanation from you will ever suffice. The door to their peace does not open with your words. It opens with their own acceptance. This is the great divide between those who heal and those who remain stuck. The healed make peace with the unknown. The rest spend their lives chasing ghosts and call it a search for closure. There is a quiet cruelty in constantly explaining yourself. It teaches others that your peace is negotiable, that your mind is a door they can knock on whenever they feel unsettled. But you are not responsible for making others comfortable with your absence. You are not the architect of their emotional recovery. And if they felt entitled to your reasons, it only proves why they were never ready to hear them. When you choose to say nothing, you offer them a gift they may never recognize, the space to finally confront themselves. For it is only in the starkness of your silence that their own thoughts become loud enough to hear. You are not punishing them. You are revealing them to themselves. You are holding up a mirror, not a microphone. The mind craves completion, but it does not need it. What it truly needs is resilience, the ability to live with unanswered questions, to carry pain without the urge to hurl it back at its source. This is the heart of Stoicism, not the absence of emotion, but the mastery of it, not the suppression of truth, but the refusal to let it be used as a weapon against your own tranquility. When you withhold closure, you are not withholding kindness. You are simply refusing to participate in a story that is already over, a story that does not need another chapter just because someone else was not ready for the book to close. And if they choose to keep rereading the silence, that is their journey now. You have already written your final word. They just haven't realized it was never spoken at all. If the connection had ever been truly valued, they would have paid attention when it mattered, while you were still present, not after the silence fell, not after your energy shifted, and certainly not after you had already emotionally withdrawn. People feel an absence far more acutely than they ever appreciate a presence. But noticing too late does not grant them the right to demand closure, especially when they ignored every sign that preceded the silence. Sometimes, the most loving act of self-preservation is to stop explaining yourself, to cease negotiating for a peace they were never willing to protect. They will call you cold. They will call you inconsiderate. But what they are truly saying is, I am not accustomed to people leaving my life without feeling obligated to justify their departure. And that, in itself, is the only validation you need. You did not leave to wound them. You left because to stay would have meant betraying the person you were becoming. You left because it was time. A complete sentence that requires no punctuation, only the courage to be lived. So when they ask for closure, ask yourself, what would that even look like? What could you possibly say that your silence, your distance, and your boundaries have not already articulated? Would they truly hear your words, or would they simply twist them to fit the narrative they need? The one where you were the problem, where you overreacted, where you gave up too soon? There is a profound power in leaving the story unexplained. When you offer no final word, you leave the narrative exactly where it hurt. This is not to prolong their suffering, but to honor your own. Because sometimes the only way to respect your journey is to let it end without drawing a map for those who never bothered to walk beside you. Their pain is no longer yours to resolve. It is theirs to understand, should they ever choose to. And perhaps they never will. Perhaps they will carry your silence like a grudge, a wound, or a mystery, but they will carry it. And in that weight, in that lingering question, they will be forced to either grow or remain stagnant. Either way, your responsibility has ended. You have already found your peace. If they still need an ending, they must find it within themselves. You are no longer writing that chapter. You are already living the next one. There is a strange comfort people find in words, even angry ones. Once the feelings are spoken, be it sorrow, disappointment, or rage, they begin to lose their sharp edges. The mind seizes the explanation, filing it away, organizing it, diluting its potency. This is the function of language. It offers a structure for chaos, a way to make sense of pain. The more you explain, the more manageable you become to others. But silence operates on a different plane entirely. It is not passive or empty. It is a charged and active space. By withholding words, by refusing to narrate your pain, you leave behind a void that cannot be easily filled. You create something open-ended, unfinished. This unsettles people far more than any confrontation because it gives them nothing to hold on to, nothing to blame, nothing to build a story around. It offers them a mirror instead of a script, and a mirror is much harder to escape. It reflects the questions they've avoided, the blind spots they've ignored, the discomfort they hoped closure would erase. Most mistake this silence for avoidance, but true silence is restraint. It is the wisdom of knowing that your words are not a remedy for everyone's confusion, that not every wound is meant to be dissected. When you speak, you offer them clarity. When you remain silent, you give them weight. And that weight settles differently. It seeps into the quiet moments, echoing in the spaces between their distractions. It is in this slow, evolving presence that you become unforgettable, not for the noise you made, but for the profound stillness you left behind. Carl Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Often, that journey only begins when someone is forced to sit in the silence you created." True reflection doesn't start when you answer their questions. It begins when you stop answering altogether. When they can no longer hear your voice, they are forced to hear their own, and that is often what they fear most. Not the loss of your presence, but the confrontation with their own thoughts in your absence. Your words could have been a distraction, a way to soften the blow, but silence turns the spotlight inward. It is not cruelty. It is consequence. It is what happens when you decide your piece no longer requires a performance. Words can be misquoted, twisted, and weaponized, but silence is irrefutable. It draws a definitive line without ever speaking its name. That quiet defiance leaves no room for argument, and the mind, which despises ambiguity, will obsess over what it cannot define. In their search for a villain and a motive, they will inadvertently reveal more about themselves than they ever knew about you. Speaking gives them resolution. It allows them to categorize you, file the memory away, and move on. Silence, however, denies them that neat conclusion. You remain undefined, a lingering presence that reshapes them from within. We are so conditioned to fill every void with justifications, but some endings are too sacred to be flattened into a conversation. By honoring that silence, you choose depth over resolution. Eventually, they will stop searching for answers from you and begin seeking understanding within themselves. That is the turning point. That is when they realize your silence was not a punishment, but an invitation to grow, to listen more deeply, not to your voice, but to the part of themselves they had long ignored. The urge to speak is powerful, especially when you know you could make them understand. But at what cost? Understanding merely satisfies their curiosity. Silence, however, can fuel their transformation. One is for their comfort, the other is for their growth. Sometimes the most compassionate act is to let someone grow in the quiet space you leave behind. When you speak, you release them. When you are silent, you become the lesson they must learn for themselves. In a world addicted to easy answers, you gave them something far more powerful. The mystery, the absence, the space to finally face their own soul. Your silence is often mistaken for indifference. It's a quiet space that others rush to fill with their own assumptions, that you've shut down, that you no longer care, that your heart has grown cold. But they fail to grasp a fundamental truth. Silence can be the most resonant answer of all. Not the desperate quiet that begs to be understood, but the profound stillness that declares, with absolute finality, that you are done participating in the noise. You have come to understand something vital. Your peace is not a negotiation. It is not an offering to be placed on the table each time someone demands access to your energy. It is yours, and protecting it does not make you cruel. It makes you wise. True discipline is not the denial of emotion, but the art of channeling it with purpose. And silence, when chosen with intention, is the highest form of that discipline. You have witnessed the aftermath of oversharing, the way a sacred truth can bleed out into hands not ready to hold it. It brings no healing, only a hollow vulnerability, a feeling of being profoundly misunderstood. This is why your silence has become sacred. It is not an act of hiding, but of honoring your truth by no longer offering it to places that proved themselves unworthy when they had the chance. There is an incredible power in saying nothing, in letting the shape of your absence speak for itself. A power in refusing to turn your pain into a performance, in stepping back without pulling another soul into a final, dramatic scene. The world is a cacophony of voices, always talking, defending, justifying. So few have the courage to simply be still, to say, "You will find your own way through this," and then grant them the dignity of doing so, without correction, without a follow-up, without any attempt to shape the narrative in your favor. That is strength. That is ownership of the self. True control was never about managing the actions of others. It is about mastering your own response. And in some moments, The most powerful response is no response at all, not because you are fleeing from conflict, but because the conflict no longer deserves your presence. The chapter has closed, and there is no need to underline the final sentence for it to hold its meaning. The lesson was already written. If they missed it, no amount of explanation will help them find it now. As Carl Jung said, knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people. This is the heart of it. You are not suppressing what you feel. You are simply refusing to weaponize it. You refuse to turn your pain into ammunition. Instead, you hold it. You sit with it. And you allow it to sharpen your awareness, not your words. That kind of internal work requires no audience. It needs no validation. It simply needs space. And sometimes, silence is the only way to create that space. You owe no explanation for your wounds. There is no need to bleed in front of the one who held the blade, simply to make them understand the damage they have caused. You are not responsible for educating someone who never took the time to see your value when you were standing right in front of them. Allowing them to feel the full consequence of your absence is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of clarity. It is the moment you decide your energy is no longer available for their repairs because it has been redirected entirely toward your own healing. Not every ending requires a monologue. Not every goodbye needs to be spoken aloud. Sometimes, to leave in silence is the most honest act of all, for it shows you have finally stopped trying to make things right for everyone but yourself. You are not leaving to make a point. You are leaving because to stay would be the ultimate self-betrayal. And in that realization, your silence transforms. It ceases to be a passive void and becomes a sacred boundary, a line drawn not in anger, but in wisdom. You owe your peace to no one, not to the person who hurt you, not to the world that wants you to soften your truth, not even to the ghost of your past self who still aches to be understood. When you choose silence, you are not shutting the world out. You are choosing to turn inward, to be with yourself, with your integrity, with the version of you who finally understands that peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the absence of the need to explain your own existence. There is a profound dignity in restraint, a quiet power in non-reaction. This quiet is not a void, it is a statement. It says, I am no longer available for chaos disguised as conversation. And that is not bitterness. It is the highest form of self-respect. Those who misunderstand your silence were never truly listening to begin with. Let them talk. Let them speculate. Let them build their version of the story. Meanwhile, you will protect what truly matters, not your reputation, but your inner world. Because when you master the discipline of silence, you begin to hear yourself more clearly than you have ever heard anyone else. And that is where your real power lives. Quiet, steady, and unshaken. Often, what cuts the deepest is not the departure itself, but the echoing silence that follows it. It is the not knowing, why someone left, why the warmth vanished, why a closeness that felt so real dissolved without a trace. That chasm between what was known and what now is becomes a space haunted by doubt, by questions that grow louder in the quiet. This is why people chase closure so desperately. It's not always about finding understanding. More often, it is about escaping the ache of uncertainty. But confusion, if one is brave enough to sit with it, eventually becomes a mirror. It forces a person to gaze upon everything they have avoided. How they showed up, what they chose to ignore, the part they played in their own loss. That is what they are truly running from, not your absence, but their own reflection within it. As Carl Jung wrote, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. Awareness is not born from comfort, it is born from discomfort, deep, unrelenting discomfort. The kind that keeps you awake at night, not because of what was said, but because of everything that wasn't. In that space, silence ceases to be a punishment. It becomes a threshold, a defining moment that separates who they were before they lost you from who they must become to understand why. People will say they want honesty, but what they often seek is reassurance. They want you to tell them it wasn't their fault, that it was all you, that your leaving had nothing to do with them. But that is not honesty. It is a performance, a carefully scripted exit designed to protect their ego. The moment you participate, you deny them the one thing they need, a confrontation with their own truth. You grant them a fleeting peace, but at the immense cost of their growth. There is a quiet power in refusing to explain, not because you wish them to suffer, but because you respect the process of awakening too much to interfere. You understand that real insight is never found in answers handed to you by another. It is forged in the fires of asking yourself better questions, and those questions only arise when you are left to sit in the silence long enough to ask, "What does this say about me? What does this reveal that I haven't wanted to see?" When you walk away without a script of reasons, you invite them into the only confrontation that truly matters, not with you, but with themselves. Your absence, your silence, this refusal to explain. It is not a wall you have built. It is a mirror you have left behind. And mirrors do not change people. They simply reveal what is already there. Whether they flee from that reflection or grow from it is their journey to take. Obsession is rarely born of love. It is born of uncertainty. It grows in the fertile ground of questions that were never answered, of conversations that ended mid-sentence. People do not replay your memory because they care more than anyone ever has. They replay it because their minds cannot close the loop. Something was left unfinished, and the human psyche cannot tolerate a fractured narrative. It will spin and replay and analyze, not in a search for peace, but in a desperate attempt to solve the unsolvable. The absence of closure is more than just silence. It becomes a riddle, and the longer it remains unsolved, the more they become consumed by it, not because you are the center of their heart, but because you have become the center of their confusion. As Jung also said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Obsession is precisely that. It turns your absence into a living presence within their unconscious mind. Think of closure as the door one walks through to finally exit an emotional room. When that door is simply not there, they are left to circle the same walls, endlessly searching for a way out. There is something uniquely haunting about a person who never gave you an ending. You can neither hate them completely nor love them completely. You cannot even forget them completely. They exist in a liminal space in your mind, suspended forever between what was and what could have been. But you know the truth now. You know this silence is not a game. It is a reflection of a boundary you finally learned to honor. You understand that allowing someone to sit in the discomfort of their own confusion is not manipulation. It is the honest consequence of a story that required no more words. Obsession is a prison built from questions, and unanswered questions over time harden into bars. But you did not build their prison. You simply stopped handing keys to people who insisted on locking themselves inside. You walked out the front door and chose peace over explanation, stillness over closure. In doing so, you gave them the one thing they could not handle, an ending that forced them to question themselves more than they ever questioned you. And perhaps one day, that will be the beginning of their freedom. But until then, they will carry you, not as a person, but as a thought that never quiets, a thread they can't stop pulling, a silence that never resolves into a sentence. When someone pleads, "Just be honest with me," what they're truly asking for is release. They're saying, "Please set me free." But freedom is never a gift from another. It is not a lock you can open for them with the perfect combination of words or the right tone of voice. True freedom is earned, not through the hollow act of closure, but through the difficult work of acceptance. And yet, most will never grasp this. They remain convinced that if you would just explain why, if you would only grant them one more conversation, one final reason, they could finally move on. They fail to understand that your silence is not the cage that holds them. Their own refusal to accept what is, that is the real prison. And sometimes the most honest thing you can do is not respond at all. It sounds harsh, I know. People crave communication, they demand clarity. But beneath that, what they truly want is to be relieved from the discomfort of the unknown. They want a story that ends on their terms, neatly tied with a ribbon, so they can walk away feeling justified and in control. But life rarely offers such a luxury. Some endings are jagged. Some never come with closure, because closure is never owed, especially when the other person has already left the room. At a certain point, the need to know ceases to be about healing and becomes a form of control, a way to keep a connection alive, even if only through questions and imagined conversations. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." The wisdom holds here, because the moment someone expects you to grant them peace with your words, they have placed their emotional freedom in your hands. And were you to answer, to explain, to give them what they think they need, they might feel better for a moment, but it would not last, because their healing was never about you. It is about whether they can learn to accept something without understanding it completely, whether they can let go without having every piece of the puzzle. Most cannot. And so they keep reaching for you, believing you hold the key to their release, when in truth, they are the ones holding the lock shut. When you remain silent, people will interpret it however their mind needs to. Some will call you cold, others afraid. Some will believe you are punishing them. But what you are actually doing is stepping back. You are respecting a necessary boundary. You are allowing them to find their own strength, rather than handing them another excuse to avoid facing themselves. That is the part they rarely acknowledge. Their obsession with closure isn't about what you did. It's about what they have yet to accept. And if you were to speak, you would only delay the one thing that truly matters, their own growth. People often mistake the silence of another for a weapon, as if your absence is a tool of control. But it is your responsibility to decide not to engage. It is not your responsibility to manage how they interpret that decision. You did not promise to be their healer. You did not agree to be their final therapist. And if they cannot move on without you spelling everything out, perhaps that says more about their dependence than your decision. Sometimes guilt tempts us to answer. We see their pain, their confusion, their desperate attempts to make sense of it all, and we feel responsible. But this is a trap. It drags you back into a dynamic you had the courage to escape, and it never works. The more you explain, the more they ask. The more you give, the more they need. It is a cycle without end, because they are not seeking truth. They are seeking control over a story that has already concluded. The only way to truly end it is to stop feeding it. There is a quiet wisdom in letting someone wrestle with your silence. In that unresolved space, you become something they must sit with, not a voice in their inbox, but an echo in their mind. They are left with only one option: to look inward, to ask themselves why they so desperately need to hear from someone who is already gone, why they believe someone else's words can do for them what their own acceptance cannot. Sometimes people don't want closure. They want to feel that they mattered, that their presence left a mark, that they were important enough to deserve a final explanation. And perhaps they were. But being important does not mean being entitled. You can value someone deeply and still walk away without saying everything, because sometimes saying everything means offering parts of yourself that were never truly seen and would not be understood now, even if you screamed them. Silence isn't cruelty. It is clarity, wrapped in self-protection. It is the decision to stop handing your peace to people who might just drop it again. When someone asks for honesty, remember that they may not want the truth. They may want a version of it that soothes them, that casts them as the victim left behind by someone too emotionally distant to communicate. But if your silence is rooted in your truth, then you have already been honest. You have said what needed to be said, even with your absence. That does not make you heartless. It makes you disciplined. Seneca once said, "He who is brave is free." And freedom, in this sense, is the bravery to walk away without tying up every loose end. To accept that not every story needs a moral. Some just end. Abruptly. Quietly. And those left behind must make peace with the silence, not because you didn't care, but because you cared enough about your own sanity to stop explaining what was never truly heard in the first place. The need for closure is human, but it is also a trap. It keeps people cycling back to moments that have passed, to people who have left, to feelings that are no longer reciprocated. And the longer they linger there, the further they drift from the truth, that their freedom does not lie in your mouth. It lies in their hands. It always has. You can love someone and still recognize that silence is the only gift left to give, because anything more would simply fuel more questions, more expectations, more attachments. Sometimes loving someone means letting them sit in the discomfort of their own thoughts, not because you don't care, but because you do. Enough to stop playing a role in a story that needs to end. Eventually, they may stop asking, not because they received an answer, but because they realized they never would. And in that realization, something shifts. The question's quiet. The obsession fades. The need to be freed by you transforms into a decision to free themselves. That moment, that is real closure. The kind that comes not from your voice but from their own. There is a silence that echoes longer than any shouted goodbye, not because it is loud, but because it leaves space. When you walk away without finishing the story, you do not erase your presence. You amplify it. You leave them with fragments, not a conclusion. And those fragments fester into questions. Those questions curdle into memories. And those memories become the stories they tell themselves in the dead of night, trying to piece together something that no longer belongs to them. An unfinished story does not die. It loops, quietly and endlessly, and every version they invent will feel incomplete, because deep down, they will always know they were not meant to write the ending. Their rewriting of you is not a loss. It is a mirror. It reflects only their own needs, their own projections, their own profound inability to sit with what truly happened. That refusal to give them an ending, that is what stays with them. The mind clings to ambiguity. It fixates on the unanswered. This is how people become haunted. Not by trauma, but by possibilities. Not by pain, but by questions. Carl Jung wrote, "What you do not bring to consciousness appears in your life as fate." When you deny them a neat conclusion, you become their fate, not a fact. You are not a chapter they closed, but a shadow that stretches over every new connection. They will measure new beginnings against the weight of your silence, not because you were perfect, but because you were never fully understood. And people do not obsess over what they comprehend. They obsess over what makes no sense. Your silence is your closure. Your departure is your final sentence. And if they still feel there is more to say, that is no longer your weight to carry. There is a strange dignity in leaving without an explanation they can handle. People want you to shrink your absence into something small enough to fit in a box labeled, "I understand." But some departures are not meant to be understood. They are meant to be felt. Your silence becomes the consequence they must live with. The temptation to explain is always there, especially if you still care. But the moment you offer them closure, they are free. Free to forget. Free to walk away convinced they understood you. And sometimes that is more painful than being misunderstood. Because people who believe they understood you will never revisit their mistakes. They will not grow from your absence. They will simply move on, untouched. When you let them write their own ending, you become the story they revisit when things fall apart, the mystery that becomes a silent teacher. Because unfinished stories don't fade. They ferment. And over time, they will realize that no matter how many versions they write, none bring them peace. Peace does not come from completing the narrative. It comes from accepting that some stories are not meant to end the way we want them to. Plato said, "We can easily forgive a child who is afraid of the dark. The real tragedy of life is when men are afraid of the light." The light, here, is their own truth. The truth they have been avoiding by chasing your words, your reasons, your final chapter. But you do not owe it to them to drag them into the light. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is leave the page unfinished. Let them sit in the darkness of not knowing. Let them find their own light. You gave what you could, and when it was no longer valued, you left. Not with a bang, but with the quiet restraint of dignity. That is not something to apologize for. It is something to be proud of. Because not everyone has the strength to walk away from a story half-written, knowing that the silence will echo louder than any explanation ever could. So let them wonder. You have already turned the page. Whether they catch up or not, you are free, and they are left holding a pen, with nothing but questions and the memory of someone who never gave them an ending they felt they deserved. When you give someone an explanation, you are handing them an exit, a map out of the discomfort they created. You tell them why, and suddenly they have something to hold, a reason to soothe their ego. It may seem kind, but it is often a way of sparing them from the shadow of their own choices. People think they want truth, but they usually want relief. They want a narrative they can live with, something clean, something that makes them feel it wasn't their fault. And when you offer them your reasons, your pain, you are not helping them grow. You are helping them escape. Silence, however, is a different kind of reckoning. It offers no script. It leaves them in the maze of their own making. And in that maze, they begin to realize the questions they are asking are not just about you. They are about themselves. Why they didn't see the signs, why they ignored the warnings, why they treated you as permanent when you were already walking away. That is the weight of silence. It forces reflection, not because it is cruel, but because it offers no shortcuts. Jung said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." That is what silence does. It irritates, it lingers, and in that lingering, it opens a door, not to your truth, but to theirs. The absence you leave behind becomes a mirror, showing them all the parts of themselves they were too busy avoiding while trying to understand you. When you choose not to explain, you are not punishing them. You are holding a boundary, a line that says, "This is not my burden anymore." Because every time you explain, you re-enter their world, their logic, their chaos. And for what? So they can sleep at night? Perhaps that wondering is exactly what they need. Not every ending needs to be softened. Sometimes the most respectful thing you can do is let someone sit with the sharp edges of what they have lost. That is how real transformation happens. Not through explanation, but through a silence that speaks louder than words ever could. We live in a world obsessed with closure, but life rarely works that way. And the more we chase those neat endings, the more we rob ourselves of growth. Because sitting in the discomfort of ambiguity is one of the few things that forces us to pause, to reevaluate, and to be humbled. When you walk away without a final chapter, you leave a space that cannot be filled with excuses. They are stuck with the whole story, unfiltered. And that is the kind of story that echoes. It was never about what you said. It's about what they fail to see when you are right in front of them. People vastly underestimate the power of absence. They mistake distance for freedom. But an emotional absence, left unexplained, becomes one of the most potent forces in the human psyche. It creates obsession, not from manipulation, but from mystery. We are wired to seek resolution, to fill in the blanks of a story. And when there are too many blanks, we begin to replay, to overanalyze, to obsess. In doing so, we carry the presence of the person who left into every room we enter. They are with us not because they haunt us, but because they were never fully understood. You might think that offering an explanation will help you move on, that if you just tell them the truth, you'll finally be free. But the truth is, you are not responsible for how they carry your absence. You are not responsible for how they choose to interpret the silence. Your only job is to protect your peace, to hold your boundaries, and to honor the part of you that refuses to be dragged back into a story that has already ended. And if your silence hurts them, perhaps it's the first time they've truly felt the weight of something real. Let them feel it. Let them sit with the questions. Let them remember you not through the clarity of your words, but through the profound presence of your restraint. That isn't cold. It's disciplined. That isn't punishment. It's power. The kind of power that doesn't need to be proven, the kind that doesn't have to shout to be heard. It is the kind that speaks more through absence than any carefully constructed goodbye ever could. So when the urge comes, when you want to send the message, write the explanation, tie up the loose ends, pause. Ask yourself who it's really for. Is it for them, or is it for the part of you that still craves to be understood? Because the people who truly valued you never needed an explanation to begin with, and the ones who didn't won't learn from it anyway. Your silence is not a weapon. It is a filter. It separates those who are ready to grow from those who just want to be pacified. When you choose to stay quiet, you don't just walk away. You rise. You become the echo in the back of their mind, the face they see when they realize they mistook presence for permanence. You don't have to tie the knot for them. Let them hold the rope. Let them feel the tension. Let them realize that not every wound gets a bandage. Some wounds exist to be felt, to be remembered, to be learned from. And if your silence becomes that lesson, then maybe it was the most honest thing you ever gave them. Some people chase peace like it's a trophy, as if every story needs a graceful ending, every wound a soothing balm. But real life doesn't always work that way. Sometimes, the kindest thing you can do is refuse to offer peace, because not all closure is healing. Some of it is just an illusion that helps people avoid accountability. We've been told that peace is the highest goal, that maturity means keeping everything calm and emotionally tidy. But peace at what cost? Your self-respect? Your clarity? Sometimes, peace is just another word for repression, a quiet cover draped over chaos. And when you choose silence over forced reconciliation, you disrupt that illusion. You leave them with the tension they tried to avoid. You let them sit in the imbalance, And in that discomfort, something real can begin to grow. Because not every relationship deserves a handshake at the end. Some endings are meant to stay jagged, to sting, to remind both of you that something real happened here. Something that can't be undone with a few polite words. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But that becoming often requires friction. It requires moments where you choose integrity over harmony, where you choose silence not because you're cold, but because you are clear. Clear that not everyone deserves access to your peace. Real peace isn't about how quiet things are on the outside. It's about how steady you remain on the inside. You see, there's a kind of silence that doesn't just protect, it reveals. It shows people who they are without your commentary. It removes the cushion of your validation, your explanations, your soothing. And when they're left without that comfort, they are forced to confront themselves. That's where the lesson lives. Not in what you say, but in what you withhold. Your silence is a space they have to fill with their own reflection. For many, that is far more powerful than closure. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let yourself be misunderstood. The moment people think they understand you, they place you in a box. But when they can't quite figure you out, when your silence leaves them wondering, you become unforgettable. Not because of what you said, but because of what you didn't explain. What can't be named can't be tamed. There's a quiet power in ambiguity, in not handing over the blueprint to your emotions. You don't have to justify the way you heal or the way you withdraw when things become too loud. People who demand full access to your inner world are rarely interested in your truth. They are looking for a version of you they can manage, but when they don't understand you, you stay with them. Not as a story neatly closed, but as a question left open, an echo they can't quite resolve. The human mind craves closure, but you are not a story. You are a process, a paradox, a constant state of becoming. And those who rush to define you interrupt that process. There is a silent strength in walking away without a final word, in choosing not to correct the narrative they've written in their heads. Let them write it. Let them get it wrong. Because that error they carry is its own kind of justice, and in time, it will weigh more than your words ever could. When you let go of the need to be understood, you conserve your energy for what truly matters, becoming who you were meant to be, not who they assumed you were. You will be called distant, cold, arrogant. People are scared of what they can't define. Let them speak. Their labels don't touch you. They echo in the space between who you are and who they imagine you to be. And in that space, you remain free. Being misunderstood doesn't mean you've failed to communicate. It often means you have refused to perform. You held your truth in silence and let your presence do the talking. And presence doesn't always come with subtitles. Sometimes it just lingers. Quiet, intense, unresolved. That is more powerful than anything they ever expected you to say. So stay unreadable. Not because you are hiding, but because you've realized you don't need to be known to be powerful. You don't need to be explained to be felt. You don't need to be understood to be free. Let the mystery remain. Let the silence echo. Let your absence say what words never could. Because in a world addicted to noise, your silence becomes sacred. It becomes the reason they can't stop thinking about you. Not because you said something profound, but because you didn't say anything at all. They will call it many things: avoidance, immaturity, a fortress of coldness. But these are merely the names an ego gives to the sting of being left without a script to follow. As time settles, the noise of their judgment quiets, and what remains is a profound truth. Silence is not emptiness. It is a presence. It is heavy with all that was left unsaid, dense with misunderstandings, and haunted by the questions they now long to ask, but to which they no longer have access. You see, a conventional goodbye comes with answers, neatly packaged in reasons and moments of closure. But silence. Silence hands them the pen and makes them responsible for writing their own ending. A burden of authorship most are unready to bear. They want you to explain, to validate their version of the story, to tie it all up in a neat bow so it can be safely stored in the past. But you owe them no such thing, not if their presence failed to honor your truth when it mattered most. Not if their search for understanding is merely a pursuit of comfort, not growth. When you give someone a proper goodbye, you release them. But when you leave them in silence, you give them something else entirely. The space to confront their own role in your departure. And that is a lesson far more powerful than any spoken explanation. It is the difference between helping them move on and compelling them to look inward. People underestimate the sheer volume of silence. They imagine that if nothing is said, nothing is felt. But the human mind abhors a vacuum. It will rush to fill the quiet with meaning, with memory, and so often with regret. When that silence is intentional, born not of weakness, but of strength, it carries a different weight. It becomes a symbol that something deeper than a relationship was lost. A shared understanding, a connection that can no longer be defined by words. So you need not slam the door, nor compose the perfect final message. You need not break it down or tie it up. You only need to step back. Let them notice the absence. Let them sit in it. Let them wonder, unravel, and guess until the silence stretches so far that they finally realize they were never truly listening to you. They were only listening to the version of you they had constructed in their minds, a version that cannot survive in the stark reality of silence, for silence strips away fantasy. It does not reinforce their illusions, it shatters them, and that disruption is the beginning of a truth they may never admit aloud, but will feel every time your name crosses their thoughts. A goodbye may offer peace, but silence offers transformation. It invites reflection, discomfort, and even a reckoning with the self, not for the sake of vengeance, but for the possibility of growth, for the hope that next time they might listen more closely, value more deeply, and choose more wisely. You were never responsible for their enlightenment, only for your own integrity, for preserving your peace and honoring your truth, even when it didn't fit their narrative. This is the sacred work of silence. It protects your spirit from being dissected, debated, and diluted. It declares, I do not need to be remembered clearly. I only need to be remembered honestly. And sometimes, honesty only finds its voice when all the noise has stopped. So when you are tempted to explain, pause. When you long to say one last thing, simply breathe. When they demand clarity, give them space instead. Because if they truly valued what was lost, they will feel its weight in the silence. And if they did not, no explanation would have ever been enough. In the end, what lingers is not what you said, but what they were left to feel and could never resolve. The confusion, the ache, the unanswered questions. That is what teaches. You do not need to deliver the lesson, only to leave room for it. Without a word, without a sound, your impact is made. They might forget a goodbye, but they will remember the silence. Because silence doesn't just tell them the story, it makes them live inside it, long after you are gone. This is the path of the Stoic, who does not perform for closure or explain for applause. In a world that demands a justification for every exit, the Stoic walks away, refusing to burn energy on what no longer aligns with their truth. This is not because they don't care, but because they care too much about preserving their inner peace over pleasing external confusion. People mistake this silence for cruelty, but there is a profound difference between abandoning someone and refusing to abandon yourself for them. We are taught that closure is a final act of generosity we owe to others. But often, our explanations are not born of clarity, but of guilt, of pressure, of the fear of being misunderstood. In giving them, we dilute our own experience, shaping our truth into something more digestible for someone else's comfort. That is not kindness, it is self-betrayal. To become who you are meant to be, you must sometimes choose restraint, especially when your silence is not a weapon, but a refusal to dishonor what you have learned. This is the essence of emotional mastery, not an absence of feeling, but a refusal to be ruled by its passing storms. Emotions are real, but they are not always reliable. They arrive like weather, intense and unpredictable. To feel is human. To act on every feeling is to be a ship without a rudder. When you detach emotionally, you do not become numb. You become precise. That precision allows you to say, "This does not deserve my explanation," because not every story needs to be retold, and not every pain needs to be validated by another. There is a quiet dignity in this. Silence doesn't seek approval. It doesn't beg to be understood. It simply holds its ground. And that is what unsettles a world that believes louder is stronger. But stillness is not weakness. It is strength without the noise. It is a sacred boundary, a declaration of self-respect that says, "I will not sacrifice the clarity I have fought for simply to ease your discomfort with the unknown." This is not cruelty. This is clarity. The more you grow, the more you realize how rare peace is, and how expensive it becomes to explain yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. At some point, you must ask, am I speaking to connect or to be accepted? If the answer is validation, the Stoic inside you knows to step back, not as an act of pride, but of protection. For you cannot teach someone who is only listening for permission to stay the same. Emotional detachment is not a wall, it is a filter. It doesn't shut people out. It lets clarity in. It allows you to release what is not yours to fix, to explain, or to carry. And in that release, you find yourself again, whole and untouched by the chaos you chose not to engage. Seneca wrote, "He who is brave is free." And bravery is not always loud. Sometimes it is staying silent when everything inside you wants to shout. It is recognizing that walking away without a word is not abandonment, but alignment with your deepest values. A Stoic understands that not all conflicts are resolved through dialogue. Some are resolved through distance. The secret is this: when you no longer need others to understand, you become free. Their validation is not what heals you. Your own integrity is. So let your silence be your clarity. Let your stillness be your message. Let your peace speak louder than your explanations ever could. For some truths need no voice to be felt, and some endings gain their power from the very space they leave behind. If your silence is the guardian of your peace, then let it echo. Let it become a presence more profound and lasting than any word ever could.